Marriage is emotional slavery, she protested, claiming commitment was a patriarchal system built to control. So I unleashed her wild heart. Turns out, liberation isn't so sweet when nobody covers the rent. I thought I was dating a revolutionary when I met Jade 3 years ago at a climate justice rally in downtown Phoenix, where she stood on a makeshift stage with wild curly hair and intense green eyes, delivering a speech about dismantling oppressive systems that had the crowd completely mesmerized. I'm Brett, 30 years old, a structural engineer who designs bridges and buildings that actually stay upright, the kind of practical work that keeps society functioning while people debate whether society should exist at all. I make decent money, $78,000 annually, own my truck outright, and believe in building things that last, whether that's infrastructure or relationships, approaching both with the same methodical planning and attention to foundation work. Jade ran a feminist blog called Breaking Chains, where she wrote these fiery manifestos about liberation and authenticity that got shared thousands of times across social media platforms by women who felt inspired by her insights about reclaiming feminine power. Her followers worshipped her deconstructions of traditional relationship models, hanging on every word as she analyzed patriarchal structures with the fervor of someone who discovered the secret code to human liberation and wanted to share it with the world. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone preaching financial independence from men worked exactly 12 hours per week teaching consciousness-raising workshops at a local community center for $8 an hour, bringing in maybe $300 monthly when she bothered showing up consistently to her scheduled sessions. Traditional marriage is just legalized ownership of women's souls by men who want domestic servants, she'd explain over dinner at restaurants I invariably paid for, gesticulating with her fork while making profound eye contact and speaking with the conviction of someone delivering universal truth. The whole institution was designed by patriarchal societies to control feminine energy and transform wild, authentic women into compliant domestic servants who live solely for male approval, validation, and the fulfillment of masculine expectations. She had this way of making everything sound profound and political, like ordering a fair trade latte represented rebellion against corporate oppression, choosing organic quinoa constituted resistance against industrial agriculture, and shopping at local farmers' markets was striking a blow against capitalist food distribution systems. Her apartment had been decorated with protest posters from various movements, crystals arranged according to lunar phases and chakra alignment principles, and bookshelves filled with feminist theory that she'd quote during casual conversations about grocery shopping, weekend plans, or choosing which Netflix series to binge together. When we moved into our 2-bedroom apartment in Phoenix 20 months ago, I found myself covering about 85% of all monthly expenses while Jade focused on what she called dismantling capitalist constructs and building her platform as a feminist thought leader who could inspire other women toward authentic liberation from oppressive systems. Rent was $1,400 monthly, utilities averaged another $250 depending on summer cooling costs. Groceries ran $400 because she insisted on organic everything to honor her body temple, and that was before factoring in her monthly expenses for crystals, sage bundles, protest supplies, activist conference tickets, and feminist literature that supposedly supported her revolutionary work and consciousness expansion journey. I'd regularly transfer money for her car insurance, phone bill, student loan payments, and the constant stream of emergency expenses that coincided perfectly with new protest merchandise launches, activist retreat registration deadlines, or feminist conference fees that would enhance her credibility as a movement leader and expand her revolutionary network. Her blog posts about financial liberation from masculine control started appearing around the same time these transfers became routine, creating this increasingly surreal situation where she'd write 1,000-word essays condemning women's economic dependence on men while literally depending on my engineering salary to keep the lights on and maintain the revolutionary lifestyle she'd built around rejecting traditional economic structures. Money is just a tool the patriarchy uses to maintain power structures and keep women trapped in cycles of dependency and masculine control, she'd say whenever I gently mentioned our increasingly imbalanced budget during monthly financial discussions. Evolved relationships transcend these capitalist obsessions with transactional thinking about who pays what, focusing instead on spiritual contribution, revolutionary energy exchange, and mutual support for dismantling oppressive systems together as conscious partners. I'd nod and write another check, telling myself that supporting someone's passion was what good partners do, even when that passion seemed to involve attending expensive workshops about rejecting materialism while simultaneously embracing every costly aspect of conscious living that money could buy. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but I convinced myself that her revolutionary work was valuable enough to justify the financial arrangement, especially since she promised that once her blog gained more traction and sponsorship deals, she'd be financially independent and we could build something truly revolutionary together. When I suggested we start planning a future together, possibly marriage, buying property, or at least Jade contributing equally to our shared expenses, she launched into a furious manifesto that made her previous speeches look like casual conversation. I'd brought up the topic over dinner at home, thinking it was time we discussed where our relationship was heading after 3 years together and whether she might consider finding full-time work or at least increasing her hours at the community center to help balance our financial partnership. "You're trying to colonize my autonomy and imprison my revolutionary spirit in domestic chains," she declared, standing up from the table so dramatically that her chair toppled backward onto our hardwood floor. "This is exactly how the patriarchy operates. First they make you financially dependent on their system, then they use that dependency to control every aspect of your authentic self and force you into their oppressive structures." She accused me of perpetuating toxic masculinity by expecting her to participate in capitalist wage slavery, claiming that my suggestion represented a fundamental misunderstanding of her revolutionary mission and an attempt to transform her into another mindless consumer drone working for corporate masters who profit from human suffering. "You want me to become a capitalist slave who worships material security over spiritual freedom and authentic self-expression," she continued, pacing around our living room like a caged animal while gesturing wildly with her hands. "You're asking me to betray everything I believe in, to abandon my calling as a consciousness revolutionary, just so you can feel more comfortable about traditional gender roles and financial control mechanisms that keep women subjugated." The conversation escalated when she claimed that expecting financial contribution was a form of economic coercion used by the patriarchy throughout history to subjugate women who dared to think independently and challenge oppressive systems. "This is how they've always done it," she said, her voice rising to near shouting levels while pointing an accusatory finger at me. "They make women financially desperate, then offer security in exchange for compliance, creativity, and authentic self-expression. You're literally asking me to sell my soul for rent money and abandon my revolutionary work." I sat there listening to this increasingly unhinged tirade, realizing that someone who'd spent 3 years living off my income was lecturing me about financial independence and authentic living while contributing less than 5% to our household expenses and 0% to any meaningful discussions about our actual future together. Fed up with the double standard of someone preaching independence while being completely dependent, I decided to give Jade exactly what she'd been demanding for 3 years. Total liberation from any oppressive expectations or traditional relationship structures that might constrain her revolutionary spirit. "You're absolutely right," I said calmly, which seemed to catch her off guard mid-rant as she stood there with her mouth open. "You deserve complete freedom from these patriarchal constraints I've been imposing on you." I informed our landlord the next morning that I wouldn't be renewing our lease when it expired in 3 months, and I began searching for a studio apartment that would accommodate my actual budget without subsidizing someone else's revolutionary lifestyle or funding their theoretical independence movement. I gave Jade 3 months' notice to find her own path to the financial independence she'd been advocating so passionately, explaining that I was freeing her from the oppressive dynamic she'd identified in our relationship. Her reaction was immediate and contradictory. The woman who'd spent years railing against commitment suddenly panicked at the prospect of actually being free from it, as if the reality of independence was far different from the theoretical version she'd been promoting on her blog to her devoted followers. Jade cycled through increasingly desperate manipulation tactics, starting with an attempt to become the perfect revolutionary partner by cooking elaborate vegan meals and initiating deep political discussions about our shared future, dismantling oppressive systems together as a unified force against patriarchal structures. Suddenly, The woman who'd never shown interest in domestic responsibilities was preparing quinoa bowls with roasted vegetables, sprouted grain salads, and fermented kombucha while explaining how our relationship represented a sacred rebellion against societal programming designed to keep authentic lovers separated by capitalist constructs. She'd light candles and put on ambient music, creating these romantic revolutionary planning sessions where she'd spread out notebooks filled with diagrams and talk about building a compound for conscious living, starting a podcast about decolonizing relationships, or launching a retreat center for couples seeking authentic partnership models. I realize now that I was letting capitalist conditioning create artificial barriers between us, she said one evening while presenting a home-cooked meal that probably cost $40 in organic ingredients from the farmer's market. True revolutionaries support each other's missions regardless of traditional financial frameworks, and I want us to pioneer a new model of partnership that transcends monetary concerns and focuses on spiritual abundance. When the Domestic Goddess Act failed to convince me to reconsider our living situation, she pivoted to claiming our relationship represented something historically significant that couldn't be abandoned without serious consequences for the broader revolutionary movement and feminist consciousness evolution. She began leaving radical feminist literature around the apartment with passages highlighted in bright yellow marker, particularly sections about how authentic partnerships require mutual support during transitional periods, and how spiritual unions transcend material circumstances when both parties are committed to revolutionary work. Her blog posts shifted dramatically to discussing spiritual partnerships that transcend monetary concerns, while she simultaneously launched a GoFundMe campaign for her Feminist Awakening project, claiming she needed funding to complete a book about liberating women from economic dependence that would fundamentally change how society viewed relationships and financial dynamics. The campaign description mentioned her groundbreaking research into revolutionary partnership models and her need for financial support to complete this important work without compromising her artistic integrity by taking conventional employment that would drain her creative energy and revolutionary spirit. When I pointed out the irony of crowdfunding independence while living rent-free in my apartment, she accused me of gaslighting her revolutionary work and launched a comprehensive social media campaign positioning herself as a feminist martyr being abandoned by a man who couldn't handle her radical authenticity and commitment to challenging oppressive systems. Her Instagram stories featured tearful videos about how difficult it was to maintain revolutionary principles when surrounded by people who prioritized capitalist security over spiritual growth, consciousness expansion, and meaningful social change. She started posting inspirational quotes about how the patriarchy uses financial pressure to silence women's voices and shared academic articles about economic abuse, carefully crafting a public narrative where my reasonable request for equal contribution became damning evidence of masculine control, manipulation, and systematic oppression. Her feminist theory book collection grew exponentially during this period, with new titles appearing weekly as she built an intellectual fortress to justify her position and demonstrate her unwavering commitment to revolutionary scholarship and consciousness work. She'd quote Simone de Beauvoir, Bell Hooks, and Gloria Steinem during casual conversations, weaving increasingly complex theoretical frameworks around why our current arrangement represented the ideal model for conscious relationships and why changing it would constitute a betrayal of fundamental feminist principles. The manipulation reached peak absurdity when she started hosting revolutionary relationship workshops in our living room, teaching other women about transcending capitalist relationship models, while sitting in the apartment I paid for, using furniture I'd bought, eating organic snacks purchased with my grocery money, and charging attendees $50 each to learn about achieving financial independence from men while demonstrating the exact opposite behavior in her own life. Jade mobilized her feminist network like a general preparing for war, and I began receiving messages from radical activist accounts explaining how my focus on capitalist concepts like rent and bills represented internalized patriarchy that prevented me from experiencing true revolutionary love and authentic partnership. Her mentor from the Women's Collective, a middle-aged woman named Luna who wore flowing scarves and spoke exclusively in spiritual metaphors, offered to facilitate a decolonization session for our relationship, claiming my attachment to financial stability stemmed from masculine conditioning that needed to be rewired through feminist therapy and consciousness expansion work. The messages poured in through Instagram, Facebook, and even LinkedIn, as Jade's followers launched a coordinated campaign to educate me about evolved masculinity and conscious partnership dynamics that transcended traditional relationship expectations. Brother, your fixation on money is blocking your heart chakra from receiving Jade's revolutionary love frequency, wrote one bearded guy who identified himself as a masculine awakening coach and offered sliding scale sessions to help me integrate feminine wisdom into my patriarchal programming. Another message explained how spiritual partners transcend transactional energy exchange and suggested I attend a men's retreat focused on releasing capitalist programming that prevents authentic connection with divine feminine energy and revolutionary consciousness. The situation escalated dramatically when I discovered Jade had been secretly receiving $600 monthly from her wealthy grandmother's trust fund, money she never mentioned while preaching about rejecting capitalist handouts and living authentically without financial support from oppressive family structures or patriarchal institutions. I found the bank statements while looking for our lease documents, and there it was, regular deposits from Grandmother Eleanor Trust going back over 2 years, totaling more than $14,000 she'd never disclosed while I covered our rent, utilities, groceries, and her constant stream of revolutionary expenses like protest supplies and consciousness-raising workshops. When I confronted her about this hidden income stream that completely contradicted everything she'd been preaching about financial independence, she claimed family money didn't count as participation in oppressive economic systems because it was redistributing wealth from the patriarchal generation and using it strategically to fund resistance work and consciousness evolution projects that benefit the collective liberation movement. She explained with complete sincerity that accepting money from her grandmother was actually a form of revolutionary justice, since elderly wealthy women had been oppressed by patriarchal systems their entire lives and redistributing their wealth to younger feminists represented healing intergenerational trauma and correcting historical injustices. My grandmother wants to support my revolutionary work, she said, as if this justified hiding substantial monthly income while lecturing me about authentic partnership and financial transparency. She understands that traditional employment would compromise my ability to focus on dismantling oppressive systems and raising consciousness about patriarchal structures that keep women enslaved. Her feminist collective staged an elaborate intervention at our apartment the following weekend, complete with a PowerPoint presentation projected onto our living room wall about how my financial obsession represented toxic masculinity and how evolved men support women's revolutionary work without expecting transactional reciprocity or capitalist accountability measures. 7 women crowded into our living room, sitting in a circle with sage burning and crystals arranged according to lunar phases while they took turns explaining how my focus on practical concerns like rent payments demonstrated my inability to embrace revolutionary partnership models based on spiritual abundance rather than material scarcity. One activist, a performance artist named Rainbow who wore exclusively vintage clothing and had facial piercings that spelled out, "Resist," suggested I attend a men's group to unpack my capitalist programming and learn how to love without economic control or patriarchal expectations that limit feminine creative expression. Another offered to teach me about gift economy principles, where money becomes irrelevant in truly conscious relationships, explaining how indigenous cultures never used currency and how modern financial systems were designed specifically to destroy authentic human connection and spiritual partnership. Luna, the mentor figure, spoke for nearly an hour about how my engineering background had conditioned me to view relationships through mechanistic, patriarchal frameworks that reduced sacred partnership to transactional exchanges instead of spiritual energy flow between awakened souls committed to revolutionary transformation. She recommended I read specific books about decolonizing masculine consciousness and offered to guide me through ayahuasca ceremonies that would help me release ancestral programming around scarcity and control that prevents true intimacy with revolutionary feminine energy. The presentation concluded with suggestions for alternative relationship structures where I could support Jade's mission without imposing capitalist constraints. including scenarios where I'd maintain our current financial arrangement while she pursued her revolutionary work with complete autonomy and freedom to explore other connections that might enhance her consciousness evolution and expand her revolutionary impact on the collective awakening movement. With 2 weeks remaining on our lease, Jade pulled out increasingly desperate schemes that revealed just how little her revolutionary principles actually meant when her comfortable lifestyle was genuinely threatened by the reality of financial independence. It started with a fake pregnancy scare that conveniently appeared after weeks of negative pregnancy tests she'd been taking obsessively, suddenly claiming she'd missed her period and felt nauseous, complete with dramatic morning sickness performances that disappeared the moment I suggested visiting a clinic for confirmation and discussion of our options. "I can't bring a child into this world if you're going to abandon us during this vulnerable time," she sobbed, clutching her supposedly tender stomach while scrolling through baby name websites on her laptop and researching prenatal vitamins with theatrical intensity. When I offered to drive her to Planned Parenthood for a proper test and consultation about our options, including discussing how we'd handle single parenthood or co-parenting arrangements, the pregnancy symptoms mysteriously vanished overnight, and she claimed the stress of our relationship crisis had caused a false alarm that demonstrated how my emotional abandonment was affecting her reproductive health. Next came the elaborate spiritual revelation phase, where she claimed to have received a prophetic vision during a feminist ritual ceremony involving full moon meditation, crystal healing, and goddess invocation that our separation would set back the revolution by decades, because our relationship represented the blueprint for dismantling patriarchal structures through conscious partnership and revolutionary love. She described increasingly elaborate dreams where ancient feminine spirits warned her that breaking up would create negative karma affecting the entire feminist movement for generations, claiming that we were twin flames destined to pioneer new relationship models, and that my decision to leave was actually interference from patriarchal entities, trying to prevent our revolutionary work from inspiring global consciousness transformation. During this spiritually manipulative phase, I discovered she owed $2,300 to her previous roommate collective for unpaid utilities and shared expenses, debts she'd been systematically hiding while lecturing about economic justice on her blog and teaching expensive workshops about financial liberation from patriarchal systems. The revelation came when her former roommate Sarah called my phone looking for money, explaining that Jade had moved out 6 months behind on her share of electric bills, internet costs, and communal grocery expenses while promising to pay them back once her revolutionary work started generating sustainable income from conscious capitalism alternatives. When I confronted Jade about these hidden debts that completely contradicted her public persona as someone rejecting capitalist financial structures and living authentically without traditional monetary obligations, she threw her extensive collection of feminist theory books at me with surprising accuracy, screaming about how the personal is political, and my complete inability to understand that traditional debt structures are tools of oppression specifically designed to trap revolutionaries in cycles of financial slavery and prevent them from focusing on consciousness work. She escalated her manipulation campaign to contacting my family members directly, calling my conservative parents in Ohio to tell them I was abandoning a vulnerable woman who devoted 3 years of her life to building a future with their son and supporting his emotional growth. She conveniently omitted her anti-marriage stance and her extensive revolutionary rhetoric, instead presenting herself as a devoted partner who'd been actively planning our future together, complete with fabricated stories about how we discussed children, homeownership, and traditional life milestones that aligned with my parents' values. My mother called me confused and genuinely concerned, asking why I was suddenly ending what seemed like a serious relationship with someone who appeared so committed to our shared future and family planning, forcing me to explain the actual situation while Jade listened from the next room and took detailed notes for her next manipulation strategy. Her final and most elaborate gambit involved claiming she'd been offered a substantial book deal from a prominent feminist publisher and needed me to support her for just 6 more months, while she completed her groundbreaking manuscript about financial liberation from masculine control, a book that would supposedly revolutionize how society viewed relationships and economic dynamics while establishing her as a leading voice in conscious relationship theory. She produced official-looking emails from what appeared to be a legitimate publishing house, complete with contract details and advance payment schedules that painted a picture of imminent financial independence that would vindicate her revolutionary approach to life and prove that her principles could generate sustainable income. The elaborate story began unraveling when I asked to see the actual contract, and she claimed it was still in negotiation with publishing lawyers who were working out details about international distribution rights, then fell apart completely when she admitted under pressure that she hadn't actually started writing the book and the publisher emails had been carefully fabricated using a fake email account she'd created specifically to manipulate me into continuing our financial arrangement. I was going to write it, she protested when caught in this elaborate deception that had involved weeks of planning and fake correspondence. All the ideas are already there in my blog posts, I just needed time to organize them into book format, and I knew you wouldn't support my revolutionary vision unless you thought it was already validated by the traditional publishing industry. The desperation reached peak absurdity when she started a crowdfunding campaign specifically to save our revolutionary relationship, asking her followers to donate money that would allow her to contribute equally to our household expenses and prove her commitment to authentic partnership while maintaining her anti-capitalist principles and revolutionary lifestyle that rejected traditional employment structures. Moving Day revealed the apartment's contents were 90% my possessions, leaving Jade surrounded by feminist literature, protest signs, crystals she claimed channel goddess energy for revolutionary work, and a collection of expensive essential oils that supposedly enhanced consciousness but had cost more than most people's monthly grocery budgets. Her parents, wealthy suburban liberals who'd been quietly funding her activism through monthly allowances and emergency transfers, arrived to help pack and were visibly shocked to discover she'd been financially dependent on me while building an entire career around condemning financial dependence on men and promoting revolutionary independence from patriarchal economic structures. Her father, a corporate lawyer who'd been sending monthly allowance checks disguised as support for her revolutionary work, finally exploded when he realized his daughter had been simultaneously living off two men while creating content about liberating women from patriarchal financial control and masculine economic manipulation systems. "You've been taking money from both your grandmother and me while letting Brett pay for everything?" he demanded, his voice echoing through our nearly empty living room as boxes of feminist theory books sat stacked against the walls. "What exactly have you been doing with the $800 we've been sending monthly for the past 2 years? And why is your boyfriend covering rent for someone who preaches financial independence?" Jade's response involved extensive stammering about how family money was different from accepting support from patriarchal systems, but the argument that had worked on me fell completely flat when confronted by the actual patriarchs who'd been bankrolling her revolutionary lifestyle while she publicly condemned their generation's values and economic structures. Her mother, a former social worker turned suburban housewife, stood quietly packing crystals while listening to her daughter explain how accepting thousands of dollars from wealthy family members was somehow different from accepting support from a boyfriend, the cognitive dissonance finally becoming too obvious to ignore even for parents who'd been enablers for years. Meanwhile, Jade live-streamed her liberation ceremony on Instagram while simultaneously begging me to reconsider our breakup, creating increasingly surreal content where she celebrated her newfound freedom while crying about abandonment and emotional betrayal by someone who'd supposedly never understood her revolutionary mission. Her followers flooded the stream with supportive comments about her brave choice to prioritize revolutionary work over capitalist security, completely unaware that she was actually being forced out due to her inability to support herself after 3 years of preaching financial independence while practicing complete financial dependence. The cognitive dissonance reached peak levels as she performed empowerment mantras about embracing authentic autonomy while frantically texting me asking if she could store her belongings in my new studio apartment temporarily until she found her own place and established sustainable income streams that aligned with her revolutionary principles. The live stream became increasingly chaotic as donations poured in from followers who believed they were supporting a conscious choice rather than witnessing a financial crisis, with Jade alternating between grateful tears for their monetary support and desperate off-camera attempts to negotiate continued dependency arrangements that would let her maintain her lifestyle without compromising her public image. Her feminist collective arrived to provide moral support and document her liberation journey for their own social media platforms, turning our apartment into a revolutionary performance space where they filmed inspirational content about choosing authenticity over security while completely missing the irony that their subject was desperately trying to avoid the consequences of her own revolutionary rhetoric. Luna, the spiritual mentor, led an elaborate sage-burning ceremony to cleanse the space of patriarchal energy, while Jade packed her protest posters and consciousness-raising workshop materials, creating this bizarre juxtaposition of spiritual liberation rituals happening alongside practical discussions about storage units and security deposits. The most absurd moment came when Jade started a new blog series called Embracing Radical Independence from her parents' suburban living room, writing posts about the courage required to reject comfortable situations that compromise revolutionary principles while her mother did laundry in the background and her father grumbled about supporting a 30-year-old daughter who refused to get traditional employment. Her first post in the series described the profound spiritual growth that comes from choosing uncertainty over security, completely reframing her forced departure as a conscious choice while privately reaching out to every ex-boyfriend and male acquaintance she could think of to explore living arrangements that wouldn't require financial contribution or traditional relationship expectations. The comments section filled with admiring responses from followers who praised her bravery and authenticity, with women sharing their own stories about choosing revolutionary paths over conventional relationships, creating this echo chamber where financial irresponsibility was celebrated as spiritual evolution and dependency was rebranded as conscious choice and revolutionary resistance. 3 weeks later, I spotted Jade at a trendy coffee shop in Scottsdale with Kevin, a wealthy tech entrepreneur who was clearly mesmerized by her revolutionary charisma and anti-establishment persona while completely oblivious to the financial reality behind her principled lifestyle and consciousness-focused rhetoric. She was wearing vintage band t-shirts and distressed jeans that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries, playing the authentic rebel who rejects material concerns role to absolute perfection while Kevin paid for her elaborate $15 oat milk latte with adaptogenic herbs, collagen peptides, and ceremonial-grade matcha. He listened intently to her passionate theories about dismantling capitalist structures and liberating human consciousness from corporate programming, nodding along as she explained how traditional relationships were designed to suppress feminine creative energy and revolutionary potential. Her Instagram stories now featured carefully curated photos with Kevin at expensive farm-to-table restaurants and organic juice bars, with captions about finding a true revolutionary ally who understands that authentic love transcends economic constructs and embraces spiritual abundance over material limitation and capitalist conditioning. She conveniently avoided any mention of his obvious wealth, his luxury Tesla parked outside, or the irony that she'd managed to find another financially successful man to fund her elaborately expensive anti-capitalist lifestyle within weeks of preaching about independence and revolutionary self-sufficiency. The posts about Kevin described him as someone who truly gets the revolutionary mission and a conscious partner who supports feminine empowerment without patriarchal expectations, which I interpreted as code for another guy willing to pay my bills while I lecture about financial independence from men. I learned through mutual friends that she'd moved in with Kevin after claiming her parents were too invested in patriarchal systems to understand her revolutionary mission and were trying to control her authentic expression through financial manipulation and traditional expectations about employment, responsibility, and contributing meaningfully to society instead of living off family money while criticizing the systems that generated that wealth.